Jake Morrison stood at the viewing window of the transport ship, watching the green moon of Verdania Prime grow larger as they approached. His hands pressed against the cool metal surface as he tried to calm his nerves. This was his first time off Earth, and everything felt strange and new. The artificial gravity was slightly different, making him feel lighter on his feet. The air had a metallic taste that reminded him of old coins. Around him, 11 other students from different worlds chatted nervously in various languages. Some spoke in clicks and whistles, others in deep rumbling sounds that seemed to come from their chests. Jake was the only human among them, selected from thousands of applicants to represent Earth in the first interspecies survival training program. The idea seemed simple enough when he had applied 6 months ago. Students from different planets would learn basic survival skills together on a forest moon. It would help build understanding between species and prepare young people for the challenges of exploring new worlds. Jake had grown up camping with his grandfather in the mountains of Colorado, so he figured he had a good chance of doing well. Now, looking at his fellow students, Jake wondered if he had made a mistake. The student sitting closest to him was named Zektar from a planet called Vorthek. His body looked like it was made of living crystal, with sharp edges that caught the light as he moved. Zektar had been explaining to another student how his people had built floating cities using advanced technology, but he seemed worried about the upcoming test. "My species has not needed primitive skills for over 3,000 years, Zektar said in perfectly clear English, though his voice sounded like wind chimes. "We have machines that provide everything we need. I have studied the theory of shelter, construction, but I have never actually built anything with my hands." Near the back of the transport, a blue-skinned student named Lisa sat quietly. She was from an ocean world called Nereid, and Jake could see gills along her neck that opened and closed slowly. She wore a special suit that kept her skin moist, and she carried a breathing device that she used every few minutes. Her large, dark eyes looked scared as she stared out at the approaching forest moon. "I have never been away from water for more than a few hours," Lisa whispered to the student next to her. "My people live in underwater cities. I know about land survival from books, but the dry air makes me feel sick." Jake listened to these conversations with growing surprise. He had expected his fellow students to be experts in survival skills, since they had been chosen for this special program. Instead, they all seemed to be worried about basic things like finding food and building shelter. A short, furry student named Brix kept scratching at the viewing window with his long claws. He was from a planet called Subteros, where his people lived in underground tunnels. His eyes were tiny, and he squinted constantly in the bright light of the transport ship. "Surface living is not natural," Brix muttered in a gravelly voice. "My people dig deep homes in the earth. These trees and open spaces make no sense to me. How can anyone live without tunnels?" The strangest student was named Finn, who seemed to float a few inches above his seat. He was from a gas giant planet, and his body was thin and light, like he was made of mist. He moved very slowly and seemed to struggle with the solid surfaces of the ship. "This gravity is too strong," Finn said in a voice that sounded like a whisper. "My people live in the clouds? We have never touched solid ground. I do not understand how anyone can walk on such hard surfaces." Jake began to realize that he might be the only student who had any real experience with wilderness survival. While the others had advanced technology and impressive civilizations, none of them had ever spent time in nature. They had all studied survival theory in schools, but they had never actually lived outdoors. The transport ship shuddered slightly as it entered the atmosphere of Verdania Prime. Through the window, Jake could see endless forests stretching to the horizon. The trees looked similar to the ones back home on Earth, but they were much taller and had strange purple leaves mixed in with the green ones. Rivers wound through the forest like silver ribbons, and he could see clearings where the sunlight broke through the canopy. "Attention, students," came a voice over the ship's communication system. "This is Commander Vex. We will be landing at the training facility in 10 minutes. Prepare yourselves for the briefing." Jake had seen Commander Vex during the selection process on Earth. He was a member of the Drachneri species, a race of military-minded aliens who looked like 7-foot-tall lizards with armor-like scales. His voice was deep and intimidating, and his yellow eyes seemed to see everything. The Drachneri were known throughout the galaxy as expert warriors and survival specialists. As the ship landed with a soft thud, Jake grabbed his small backpack and followed the other students toward the exit. The door opened with a hiss, and warm, humid air rushed into the ship. Jake breathed deeply, enjoying the rich smell of earth and growing plants. It reminded him of the forest back home. The other students did not seem to enjoy the fresh air as much as Jake did. Zektar made a sound like breaking glass as he stepped onto the soft ground. Lisa immediately pulled out her breathing device and took several long breaths. Brix tried to dig his claws into the earth, but the soil was too soft and he stumbled. Finn moved so slowly that 2 other students had to help him walk. The training facility was a simple building made of metal and glass, surrounded by the towering forest. It looked small and temporary, like it had been built quickly just for this program. Commander Vex stood waiting for them at the entrance, his massive form casting a long shadow across the ground. "Welcome to Verdania Prime," Commander Vex said as the students gathered around him. "This moon has been chosen for your training because it represents the kind of environment you may encounter on unexplored worlds. The forest is dense, the weather can change quickly, and there are many challenges that will test your ability to survive." He gestured toward the forest with one clawed hand. "Your test will begin at sunrise tomorrow. Each of you will be taken to a different location in the forest, at least 5 miles from any other student. You will have basic tools and supplies, but you must survive on your own for 72 hours. Jake felt excited as he listened to the commander's words. 3 days in the forest sounded like a fun adventure, similar to the camping trips he had taken with his grandfather. He wondered what kind of animals lived in the forest and whether the plants were edible. The other students looked terrified. Zektar was making worried clicking sounds, and his crystal body was changing colors from clear to dark purple. Lisa was breathing heavily through her device, and her gills were opening and closing rapidly. Brix was trying to dig a hole in the ground with his claws, even though they were still standing in front of the building. "The tools you will receive are basic," Commander Vex continued. "A knife, rope, fire starter, and water purification tablets. You may also choose one additional item from the supply room. The goal is not just to survive, but to demonstrate your ability to adapt and thrive in a primitive environment." As they walked into the facility for their final briefing, Jake could hear his fellow students talking anxiously about the challenge ahead. They discussed theories about calorie requirements, optimal shelter design, and water location strategies. Everything they said came from textbooks and computer simulations. Jake listened quietly, thinking about the practical lessons his grandfather had taught him in the Colorado mountains. While his classmates worried about theory, Jake was already planning how he would find food, build shelter, and stay comfortable in the forest. He had a feeling that the next 3 days were going to be very interesting. The sun was just beginning to rise when Jake felt the shuttle door open beneath his feet. Commander Vex had explained that each student would be dropped from a hover platform at their assigned location, but Jake had not expected the sudden rush of wind and the view of treetops stretching endlessly below him. "Student Morrison, you have reached your drop zone," announced the pilot, a small alien with 4 arms who worked the controls with impressive speed. "Your emergency beacon is active. Your pickup will occur in 72 hours at this exact location. Good luck." Jake took a deep breath and jumped from the platform, his parachute opening automatically as he fell toward the forest canopy. The landing was rougher than he expected, and he found himself tangled in branches about 20 feet above the ground. It took him several minutes to cut himself free with his knife and lower himself to the forest floor using his rope. Once his feet touched solid ground, Jake looked around his new home for the next 3 days. He stood in a small clearing surrounded by massive trees that rose nearly 200 feet into the sky. The trunks were so wide that it would take 4 people holding hands to wrap around them. Thick vines hung from the branches and the forest Floor was covered with fallen leaves, fallen branches, and strange purple flowers that glowed softly in the morning light. The air was warm and humid, filled with the sounds of birds calling to each other and insects buzzing among the flowers. Jake could hear the distant sound of running water, which meant there was a stream or river nearby. He smiled as he breathed in the rich smell of earth and growing plants. This was exactly the kind of place his grandfather would have loved to explore. Jake opened his backpack and laid out his supplies on a flat rock. The knife was simple but sharp, with a fixed blade about 6 inches long. The rope was 50 feet of strong nylon cord. The fire starter was a basic flint and steel kit. The water purification tablets came in a small plastic bottle with instructions in several languages. For his extra item, Jake had chosen a small hatchet from the supply room, thinking it would be useful for cutting wood and building shelter. While Jake was calmly examining his gear, his fellow students were already running into serious problems. Through their emergency communication system, Jake could hear distress calls beginning to come through on the shared frequency that all students could monitor. The first voice belonged to Zektar, the crystal student from Vorthak. His transmission was filled with static and panic. "Emergency beacon activation request," Zektar said, his voice cracking like breaking glass. "I have sustained damage to my lower extremities. The ground here is unstable. I fell through what appeared to be solid earth into some kind of animal burrow. My leg segments have hairline fractures." Jake winced as he listened. Zektar's crystal body was beautiful to look at, but it was clearly not designed for rough outdoor conditions. Any hard impact could cause serious damage to his mineral-based structure. A few minutes later, another distress call came through from Lisa, the aquatic student from Nereid. Her breathing sounded labored and desperate. "Water sources in my area appear to be contaminated with unknown minerals," she gasped. "My suit moisture reserves are dropping rapidly. The air here is much drier than predicted. I am experiencing severe dehydration symptoms." Jake shook his head sadly. Lisa's people lived in oceans, so she needed constant moisture to survive. The forest air, which felt perfectly comfortable to Jake, was like a desert to her. The communications kept coming, and each one more desperate than the last. Brix, the underground dweller from Subterrose, was having a complete breakdown. "Cannot establish proper burrow," he said, his voice muffled as if he was speaking from inside a hole. "Tree roots prevent deep digging. Soil composition is wrong. Cannot create secure underground shelter. Feel exposed and vulnerable on surface." Jake could hear the fear in Brix's voice. The small furry alien was used to living in deep tunnels where he felt safe and protected. Being on the surface under the open sky must have been terrifying for him. The gas giant dweller was barely able to communicate at all. His voice came through as a weak whisper. "Gravity too strong. Cannot maintain proper elevation. Solid surfaces causing physical stress. Unable to locate suitable atmospheric conditions for extended survival." As Jake listened to these distress calls, he began to understand just how different his situation was from his fellow students. While they were struggling with the basic challenge of existing in the forest environment, Jake felt completely at home. The forest reminded him of the camping trips he had taken with his grandfather in the Rocky Mountains, except the trees were bigger and the flowers were a different color. Jake decided to start with the most important survival priority, finding a good source of water. He followed the sound of running water through the trees, pushing aside hanging vines and stepping over fallen logs. After about 10 minutes of walking, he found a clear stream that bubbled over smooth rocks. The water looked clean and fresh, but Jake knew better than to drink from any natural source without checking it first. He filled his water bottle and added one of the purification tablets, then sat on a fallen log to wait for the chemical to work. While he waited, Jake looked around for a good place to build his shelter. His grandfather had taught him to look for certain things when choosing a campsite: protection from wind, access to water, level ground, and good drainage in case of rain. About 50 yards from the stream, Jake found the perfect spot. A cluster of 4 large trees formed a natural square with thick branches that extended out about 30 feet above the ground. The trees were old and strong, with bark that was rough, enough to provide good grip for climbing. Between the trees, the ground was level and covered with soft grass instead of the thick underbrush that filled most of the forest. Jake smiled as he looked up at the branches. Most people would have looked at this spot and seen a nice place to put a tent on the ground, but Jake saw something much better. His grandfather had taught him that the best shelter was often above ground level, where it stayed dry and was protected from ground-dwelling animals. While Jake was making his plans, the emergency communications continued to fill the air with panic. More students were requesting immediate pickup. Several were reporting injuries from trying to build basic shelters with no experience. Others were complaining about insects, strange noises, and the difficulty of finding food. Jake turned down the volume on his communicator and got to work. The first step was to climb up into the trees and examine the branches more closely. The bark was rough and easy to grip, and the branches were thick enough to support his weight easily. About 30 feet up, Jake found a perfect spot where 4 large branches came together, forming a natural platform. Using his hatchet, Jake began cutting smaller branches and vines to create building materials. He worked quickly and efficiently, using techniques his grandfather had taught him for building tree forts when he was a child. The physical work felt good after the long space journey, and Jake found himself humming quietly as he carried materials up to his chosen building site. By midday, Jake had already accomplished more than most of his fellow students would manage in the entire 3-day test. He had established a secure base location, confirmed a reliable water source, and begun construction of an elevated shelter that would keep him safe and dry. The other students were still sending distress calls every few minutes, but Jake was too busy working to pay much attention. He had a shelter to build and only 66 hours left to complete his survival masterpiece. 6 hours after the drop, Jake wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked up at what he had built so far. The basic platform was complete, stretching between the 4 large trees about 30 feet above the ground. He had lashed thick branches together with his rope, creating a floor that was solid enough to walk on safely. The platform was roughly 12 feet by 12 feet, giving him plenty of space to work and sleep. Commander Vex sat in the orbital monitoring station, watching displays that showed the location and status of all 12 students. Most of the screens were flashing red with emergency signals. Student after student was requesting immediate pickup, reporting injuries, or asking for additional supplies. The Draknari commander shook his head as he read the reports. This was supposed to be a basic survival test, but the alien students were failing badly. Then Jake's communication signal came online for the first scheduled check-in. Instead of a distress call, Jake's calm voice came through the speakers clearly. "Student Morrison reporting routine status update," Jake said. "Construction proceeding on schedule, base platform completed. Beginning work on walls and roof structure, water source secured. Food procurement initiated. No assistance required at this time." Commander Vex stared at his display screen in confusion. "Construction? What construction?" The other instructors in the monitoring room looked equally puzzled. They had expected Jake to report on basic shelter progress, not talk about construction. "Projects. Student Morrison, please clarify your current activities," Commander Vex responded. "Currently building elevated shelter with multiple functional areas," Jake replied. "Platform foundation is complete. Working on walls, roof, and interior divisions. Also constructing pulley system for material transport and rainwater collection." System. The instructors looked at each other with surprise. A pulley system? Rainwater collection? These were advanced concepts that went far beyond basic survival shelter. They had expected the students to build simple lean-to structures or maybe dig basic holes in the ground for protection. Down in the forest, Jake was already working on the next phase of his project. He had spent 2 hours building a clever pulley system using his rope and some curved branches. The system allowed him to haul heavy materials up to his platform without having to carry everything while climbing. His grandfather had taught him this technique for building tree stands for hunting, but it worked perfectly for his current project. Jake had also begun work on walls for his shelter. Using his hatchet, he cut straight branches and wove them together, with vines to create solid panels. The walls would protect him from wind and rain while still allowing air to flow through. He left spaces for windows that would give him good views of the surrounding forest. While Jake worked, he could hear constant emergency communications from his fellow students. The situation was getting worse for most of them. Zektar was now reporting that his crystal structure was developing more cracks from the humid air. His people were used to dry, controlled environments, and the forest moisture was causing his body to expand and contract in ways that created stress fractures. Lisa had found water, but she was having trouble purifying it properly. Her gills were designed for filtering ocean water, not fresh water from forest streams. The purification tablets were not working well for her biology, and she was becoming weaker from dehydration. Bricks had managed to dig a small hole, but it kept filling with water from underground springs. His fur was soaked and muddy, and he could not get warm or dry. The poor underground dweller was shivering constantly and making sad whimpering noises. Finn was in the worst condition of all. The gas giant dweller had barely moved from his landing spot. The strong gravity was crushing his light body, and he could not figure out how to build any kind of shelter with solid materials. He was used to floating in gas clouds, not working with wood and stone. Jake felt sorry for his fellow students, but he was too busy to help them. He had his own project to complete, and he was enjoying the challenge. Building with natural materials reminded him of the forts he had constructed as a child. Except now he had better tools and more advanced techniques. By the 8th hour, Jake had completed the walls and started on the roof. He was using a technique his grandfather had shown him for making waterproof covering using bark and leaves. The large trees had thick bark that peeled off in sheets, perfect for creating a roof that would keep rain out while still being flexible enough to bend with the wind. Jake was also working on interior features that would make his shelter more comfortable and functional. He built a raised sleeping area using smaller branches and soft moss he had gathered from the forest floor. He created storage areas for his gear and for food that he planned to gather. He even built a small work table where he could prepare meals and maintain his equipment. The most impressive feature was Jake's water collection system. He had noticed that the large leaves of the forest trees were shaped like funnels, perfect for catching rainwater. Jake arranged several of these leaves to direct water into his water bottle and a larger container he had made from bark. Even if the stream dried up, he would have a backup water supply. Around the 10th hour, Jake decided to test his construction by spending some time on the platform. He climbed up using the rope ladder he had built and walked around his new home. The platform was solid and stable, even when he jumped up and down on it. The walls blocked the wind, but allowed plenty of fresh air to flow through. The roof kept him completely dry when he poured water on it to test the seal. Jake was pleased with his work, but he was not finished yet. He had bigger plans for his forest home. Looking at the other trees around his main platform, Jake could see opportunities for expansion. The branches were strong enough to support additional platforms, and he had plenty of rope and building materials left. While Jake planned his next construction phase, the alien students were reaching the breaking point. More emergency beacons were activating every hour. Several students were crying or making distress sounds in their native languages. The instructors in the orbital station were discussing whether to end the test early to prevent serious injuries. Commander Vex was particularly concerned about the human student. Jake had gone silent after his last communication, and the commander worried that the human had finally encountered problems he could not handle. The other students were failing quickly, so it seemed logical that Jake would also run into difficulties. Jake was not in trouble at all. He was simply too busy working to make routine communications. He had started construction on a second platform, connected to the first one by a bridge made of rope and branches. This platform would serve as his kitchen and food preparation area, keeping cooking smells away from his sleeping area and reducing the risk of attracting animals. Jake had also begun gathering food from the forest. His grandfather had taught him to identify edible plants, and many of the forest species were similar to ones he knew from Earth. He found berry bushes edible roots and nuts from several different trees. He even built a simple fish trap from woven branches and placed it in the stream. As the 12th hour approached, Jake finally took a break from building to make another communication check. He looked up at his growing treehouse complex with satisfaction. What had started as a simple survival shelter was becoming a comfortable home that could support him for weeks or even months if necessary. Jake activated his communicator, not knowing that his next message would shock everyone in the orbital monitoring station and change the way the galaxy thought about human survival capabilities. 12 hours into the survival test, the monitoring station looked like a disaster control center. Red warning lights flashed on almost every student display screen. Commander Vex walked between the monitoring stations, reading reports that got worse with each passing hour. Zektar had completely given up trying to build shelter. The crystalline student sat in the rain under a tree, his body slowly developing more cracks as the moisture caused his mineral structure to expand and contract. His last communication had been barely understandable through the static caused by his deteriorating form. "Cannot continue construction efforts," Zektar had reported, his voice sounding like grinding glass. "Physical structure compromised by environmental conditions. Requesting immediate emergency extraction before permanent damage occurs." Lysa was in even worse condition. The aquatic student had found a muddy puddle and was lying in it, trying to keep her gills moist. Her blue skin had turned pale gray, and her breathing was rapid and shallow. She had not been able to build any shelter at all, instead spending all her time searching for water sources that could support her biology. "Emergency medical extraction required," Lisa gasped through her communicator. "Severe dehydration. Cannot locate suitable water sources. Gill function declining rapidly." Bricks had managed to dig a hole about 3 feet deep, but it was more like a muddy pit than a proper shelter. Water kept seeping in from underground springs, and the small furry student was soaked and shivering. His thick fur, which kept him warm in the dry underground tunnels of his home world, was now heavy with mud and water. "Burrow construction impossible," Bricks reported miserably. "Soil composition unsuitable for deep excavation. Cannot achieve proper underground shelter. Surface exposure causing severe psychological distress." The worst situation belonged to Finn, the gas giant dweller. He had not moved more than a few feet from his landing spot in 12 hours. The strong gravity of the forest moon was slowly crushing his lightweight body, and he could barely speak loud enough for his communicator to pick up his voice. "Cannot adapt to solid surface environment," Finn whispered. "Gravity field too intense for sustained activity. Unable to construct? Shelter using solid materials? Physical form not compatible with surface survival." Commander Vex looked at the reports with growing concern. This was supposed to be a learning experience, not a medical emergency. Half the students were requesting immediate pickup, and the other half were too distressed to communicate properly. The survival test was turning into a disaster. The most worrying situation was the complete silence from Jake Morrison, the human student. His emergency beacon was still active, showing that he was alive, but he had not made any communications in several hours. Commander Vex feared that the human had finally encountered problems he could not handle, just like all the other students. "Prepare a search and rescue team," Commander Vex ordered his staff. "If we do not hear from Student Morrison within the next hour, we will need to extract him along with the others." Just as the rescue team was getting ready to launch, Jake's communication signal suddenly activated. The human's voice came through the speakers clearly, sounding calm and relaxed. "Student Morrison reporting 12-hour status update," Jake said. Cheerfully, Treehouse Village construction complete. Beginning Phase 2 of Survival Protocol. Establishing sustainable food production and long-term habitation systems. The monitoring room fell completely silent. Every instructor stopped what they were doing and stared at the communication console. Treehouse Village? Long-term habitation systems? These were not the words they expected to hear from a student who was supposed to be struggling to survive. In primitive conditions. "Student Morrison, please repeat your last communication," Commander Vex said slowly. Primary construction phase completed ahead of schedule, Jake replied. Multi-level treehouse complex with sleeping quarters. Workshop area, food storage, and water collection systems now fully operational. Currently working on sustainable food production including fish traps, plant cultivation areas, and meat preservation. Systems. Commander Vex looked at his staff with complete confusion. The other students could barely build simple lean-to shelters, and most of them had given up trying. But the human was talking about complex construction projects and food production systems like he was planning to live in the forest permanently. Requesting immediate orbital surveillance of Student Morrison's location, Commander Vex ordered. I need visual confirmation of his reported activities. The surveillance team quickly adjusted their cameras to focus on Jake's position in the forest. What they saw on their screens defied everything they thought they knew about primitive survival techniques. Jake had not built a simple shelter. He had created an entire village in the trees. The main platform was connected to two smaller platforms by rope bridges that swayed gently in the breeze. Each platform served a different purpose, with clearly defined areas for sleeping, cooking, working, and storage. The construction was not crude or temporary. Jake had built his treehouse complex to last using advanced techniques that showed deep understanding of engineering principles. The platforms were level and stable, the walls were straight and strong, and the roof was perfectly waterproof. But the most impressive feature was the system of ropes, pulleys, and collection devices that Jake had built around his main structure. He had created a mechanical system that could haul materials up from the ground, collect rainwater from a wide area, and even included what appeared to be a primitive elevator made from rope and wooden platforms. "This is impossible," whispered one of the monitoring technicians. "How did he build all of this in 12 hours? Our engineers would need advanced tools and several days to construct something similar." Commander Vex stared at the surveillance images in disbelief. He had commanded survival training programs for 15 years, working with students from dozens of different species. He had never seen anything like what the human had accomplished. The other alien students were also monitoring Jake's communications, and panic was beginning to spread among them. If Jake's reports were accurate, he was not just surviving in the forest. He was thriving in ways that seemed impossible for a primitive survival situation. Zector, still sitting in the rain with his cracking crystal body, listened to Jake's reports with growing horror. His people had spent thousands of years developing advanced technology to make life comfortable and safe. But this human had created advanced living conditions in half a day using nothing but basic tools and forest materials. Lissa, lying in her muddy puddle, could barely believe what she was hearing. Jake was talking about sustainable water systems and food production while she could not even find enough clean water to keep her gills functioning. The contrast made her realize how helpless she was outside her ocean environment. Brix had stopped trying to dig his burrow and was just listening to Jake's communications in amazement. The human was building multiple levels and workshop areas while Brix could not even create a simple hole in the ground that would stay dry. Even Finn, who was barely conscious from the crushing gravity, understood that something extraordinary was happening. The human was accomplishing things that seemed impossible for someone working alone with primitive tools. The panic among the alien students was not just about their own failures anymore. They were beginning to understand that they had completely underestimated what humans were capable of. If Jake could build a village in 12 hours, what could humans accomplish with more time and resources? Commander Vex made a decision that would change the entire survival program. He activated his personal communication system and sent a message directly to Jake. "Student Morrison, this is Commander Vex. I'm coming down to examine your construction personally. Maintain your current position and prepare for official inspection." The commander had to see Jake's treehouse village with his own eyes before he could believe that such advanced construction was possible under primitive survival conditions. 24 hours after the test began, Commander Vex stepped out of his personal shuttle onto the forest floor near Jake's location. The Drachnary commander had expected to find crude human construction that only looked impressive to the failing alien students. Instead, He found himself staring up at something that challenged everything he thought he knew about primitive survival. Jake's treehouse complex rose 30 feet above the ground like a small city built in the branches. 3 separate platforms were connected by rope bridges that swayed gently in the morning breeze. Each platform was perfectly level and showed careful planning in its construction. The main platform was covered by a roof that looked completely waterproof, while the smaller platforms had partial coverings that would protect specific work areas from rain. What impressed Commander Vex most was the engineering sophistication of the entire structure. Jake had not just thrown together some branches and rope. He had created a complex system of supports, joints, and connections that distributed weight evenly across multiple trees. The construction showed deep understanding of physics and engineering principles that Commander Vex had not expected from a species that was new to galactic civilization. A rope suddenly dropped down from the main platform, and Jake appeared, rappelling down with smooth, controlled movements. He landed softly on the ground a few feet from Commander Vex and smiled cheerfully. "Welcome to my temporary forest home, Commander," Jake said as he unhooked himself from the rope system. "I was not expecting an inspection so early in the test. But I would be happy to show you around." Commander Vex stared at the human student with amazement. Jake looked clean, well-fed, and completely relaxed. His clothes were neat and dry, his hair was combed, and he showed no signs of stress or fatigue. He looked like someone who had just finished a pleasant camping vacation, not someone who had been struggling to survive in primitive conditions. "Student Morrison, how did you learn to construct such advanced structures?" Commander Vex asked. "This level of engineering sophistication is impressive even by galactic standards." Jake laughed and scratched his head. "This is just basic wilderness construction, Commander. My grandfather taught me these techniques when I was 8 years old. Most human children learn similar skills in school or from their families. We call it camping or outdoor education." Commander Vex felt his understanding of human capabilities shift dramatically. Basic wilderness construction? Children learn these skills? The Draknari commander had studied military engineering for decades, and he could see techniques in Jake's construction that would challenge experienced professionals. "Would you be willing to demonstrate your construction methods, Commander?" Vex asked. "Of course," Jake replied. "But first, let me show you the tour of what I have built so far." Jake attached a second rope to his harness and gestured for Commander Vex to do the same. "This is my transportation system," Jake explained. "It is much easier than climbing up and down the trees every time I need to move materials or access different levels." Commander Vex had never used such a primitive rope system before, but Jake's instructions were clear and easy to follow. Within minutes, they were both standing on the main platform 30 feet above the ground. The view from the platform was breathtaking. Commander Vex could see for miles across the forest canopy, with the stream winding like a silver ribbon through the green landscape. But what impressed him more was the organization and functionality of Jake's living space. The main platform had been divided into different areas using woven branch walls. There was a sleeping area with a comfortable bed made from soft moss and leaves. There was a workshop area with tools that Jake had made from forest materials. There was a storage area with containers made from bark and woven fibers. There was even a small library area where Jake had been keeping notes about the local plants and animals. "This is my water collection and purification system," Jake said, pointing to an elaborate arrangement of funnels, tubes, and containers. "It collects rainwater from a wide area and filters it through layers of sand, charcoal, and cloth. I can produce about 5 gallons of clean water per day, even without rain." Commander Vex examined the water system with growing amazement. It was more sophisticated than the emergency water systems used on many military spacecraft. Jake had created it using nothing but materials he had found in the forest. "And this is my food production area," Jake continued, leading Commander Vex across a rope bridge to the second platform. Here, Jake had established what could only be described as a small farm. He had containers growing edible plants that he had transplanted from the forest floor. He had drying racks where he was preserving meat and fish. He had storage containers filled with nuts, berries, and roots that he had gathered and processed. I have been experimenting with smoking fish. And meat using different types of wood? Jake explained. Some woods give better flavors than others, and some burn longer and produce more consistent heat. I have also been testing which plants grow best in containers versus natural soil. Commander Vex realized that Jake was not just surviving in the forest. He was conducting scientific research and developing improved techniques for long-term habitation. This was far beyond anything that had been expected from the survival test. The third platform contained Jake's most impressive achievement, a complete workshop where he had been making tools and equipment from forest materials. Using his knife and hatchet, Jake had created woodworking tools, rope-making equipment, and even primitive machines for processing plant fibers. I have been working on a loom for making cloth from plant fibers, Jake said, showing Commander Vex a wooden frame. With an intricate arrangement of strings and supports, I should have enough material to make a complete set of clothes within another day or two. Commander Vex stared at the loom in disbelief. Jake was planning to manufacture textiles using Stone Age technology. The Draknari commander had never heard of any species accomplishing such complex manufacturing during a survival situation. Student Morrison, how long could you continue living in this forest using only the materials available here? Commander Vex asked. Jake thought for a moment. Indefinitely, I suppose, he said. I have sustainable food and water sources, comfortable shelter, and the ability to make tools and equipment as needed. I could probably support a small community here if other people knew how to help with the work. The implications of Jake's answer hit Commander Vex like a physical blow. The human was not just surviving a 3-day test, he was establishing the foundation for permanent colonization. Jake had created the beginning of a new civilization using nothing but basic tools and forest materials. Commander Vex activated his communicator and contacted the orbital monitoring station. This is Commander Vex reporting from Student Morrison's location. The survival test is hereby concluded. All students are to be extracted immediately for debriefing. What about Student Morrison? Came the reply from the station. Should we prepare medical assistance? Student Morrison requires no assistance, Commander Vex replied. However, I am requesting that he be offered a position as survival instructor for future programs. His demonstrated capabilities exceed our current training standards by a significant margin. Jake looked surprised by this announcement. The test is over already? I was just getting started on some interesting projects. I wanted to try building a water wheel to generate power for some mechanical devices. Commander Vex shook his head in amazement. A water wheel for generating power? Jake was already planning the next phase of technological development for his forest civilization. As they rappelled back down to the ground, Commander Vex began to understand why Earth had been invited to join the Galactic Educational Consortium. The other species had mastered space travel and advanced technology, but humans had mastered something equally valuable, the ability to create civilization from nothing, within hours. Jake's fellow students had been extracted from their various emergency situations and were receiving medical treatment on the orbital station. The survival test that was supposed to last 3 days had been ended after 24 hours due to the complete failure of 11 students and the overwhelming success of 1. Jake's final report to the Galactic Educational Consortium would change how the galaxy viewed human capabilities. His recommendation was simple. If you want to learn how to survive and thrive in any environment, ask a human child. They learned these skills before they learned advanced mathematics. The galaxy was about to discover that while other species had learned to travel between stars, humans had learned to turn any planet into a home.